Welcome to the latest episode of the Collectability podcast. Today, it is my absolute pleasure to welcome the one and only Ryan Chong to speak to us at Collectability and to share some of the stories from the past, the present, and hear about his future. First, a few comments about Ryan and his biography. Ryan began his career at Christie's auction house in 2015. Joined the watch department, where he started as the department coordinator. He quickly became a cataloger and then an associate specialist. He worked on online and live auctions as well as private sales. In 2020, he joined Sotheby's as the private sales director for watches. He was tasked with growing their online buy it now offering as well as traditional private sales. In September of 2021, Ryan joined Bezel as the first employee and head of watch operations, overseeing everything related to watches. And we'll be digging into that shortly. But first, many congratulations are in order for you, Ryan, for just being listed as one of the 30 under 30 from Watchonista, alongside the likes of Frederick Arnault, Cara Barrett, Reshef Reshepi. The list goes on. And I have to quote Watchonista that this group is all about, quote, some of the best and brightest and youngest currently working to break down barriers and reinvent our industry for the better, end quote. With those words, I welcome you.
Wow, that was quite an introduction. Thank you so much for having me, John. It's really an honor to be here with you. It was an honor to be included on that list with names that I don't necessarily think I should have been mentioned with, but you know what? I think what we're doing with Bezel is really exciting, and hopefully we will be considered amongst those great companies soon. So yeah, I'm really excited for what's to come, and excited to dive into this podcast with you.
It's so good to see you. I saw you recently in California, but we're recording this on Zoom presently, and I look forward to you getting back to New York shortly, because you're starting to travel a bit more.
Definitely. Yeah, definitely traveling more. I think so. We launched our app last Tuesday. And with that, of course, it's best for us to get out in front of as many people as possible. So we were just in Miami this past weekend hosting a launch party. So that was great. And everything we've heard feedback wise has been awesome. And we're going to be on to the next city very soon, and hopefully coming to a place near you.
Hopefully soon. And if you make it to New Jersey, let me know. I will co-host the New Jersey launch party with you.
Okay.
We're going to break down this interview in two parts. First, we'll talk about your experience so far in the watch world, and then how that path has brought you to your latest initiative at Bezel. And then second, I'd like to focus on Patek Philippe, and I'm very interested in hearing your perspective and how younger Patek Philippe collectors view the brand and how they collect and how they engage. Because you are one of our younger podcast, I don't want to say victims, or one of our, you are one of our younger podcast guests. And it's amazing to hear what you have to say and what you're hearing about Patek Philippe in particular. Before we get into that, I want to dive deep and asking you some questions about your time at auction. How did it start at Christie's, and what can you tell us about that experience?
Sure. So it all started, I think, probably in high school when I took an AP art history class and found that was my passion. I just really enjoyed learning about history through objects, particularly fine art. And so when I went to college, I decided that art history is what I would major in, as well as economics, because everything I was ever told was if I only major in art history, I'd be a curator or go into academia. And I really wanted to have that business component in my life and in my career. So following college, I got an internship up in San Francisco at the Christie's office there, which was quite small, headed up by Eleanor Notides, who we both know. And about 5 months into that internship, I realized I had to go to New York to get to the headquarters of Christie's in America, because that's really where you have to be to get your foot in the door with a specific department. And at that time, my goal was to join old masters paintings department because that's what my passion was. As we both know, that didn't happen. And this opportunity came up in the watch department. And I'd always liked watches. I think I viewed them similarly to how I viewed art, but did not know much about them, was not very aware of which brands were popular, the history of the brands, everything to do with watches basically was foreign to me. So I took the job knowing that I'd be in New York, not knowing that it would lead to a career in watches. And when I got there, I think what really pushed me over the edge after the first couple of weeks was working so closely with you and seeing your passion as well as some of our other colleagues that were there. And I just fell in love with watches. And from that moment on, it's been all watches, everything. And that's how my path in the auction industry started.
I'm so glad you got on that plane and came to New York and gave the watch world a chance. I still remember the day when Eleanor Notides is currently the chairman of the West Coast for Christie's. And when you work at Christie's and Eleanor calls you, you stop whatever you're doing and you listen. And she called me and she said, John, you're going to remember this name and you're going to work with this gentleman. His name is Brian Chong. You need to put him in your department and you won't be disappointed. He's a rising star. And I remember those words and she was 100% correct. And it's amazing how I think for a lot of people starting off with a career in the watch world, those phone calls, whether from an internship and you have someone that has your back and recommends you, could really just open doors for you. So before we go more into your Christie's experience, do you have any advice for young people breaking into this business and what to do and how to do it?
I appreciate you asking that because I think this is really important to convey. So I don't come from a family that collects art, bid at auction, anything like that. So my foot in the door at Christie's was actually a great friend of mine who had done the internship in the San Francisco office before me. And she was kind enough to recommend me and one thing led to another and I got the internship. But I think for someone who is looking or interested in the auction route, it's often daunting because these departments are so well established. You know, some of the people within them are celebrities in their field, you could say. And so it is very intimidating, especially if you don't come from that type of background. I think the other thing that really led me to fall in love with watches was how accommodating and accepting and open everyone involved with them are. I remember one of the first couple of weeks we were in New York, we went to the Horological Society of New York's annual gala dinner. And everyone I met there could not have been nicer, could not have been more welcoming. And at that point, like I mentioned, I really had no idea what I was doing. But those type of interactions gave me the confidence to continue working with watches and working in the auction industry. And I think that confidence really, really helped me get to where I am today. And I owe that all to the people within the watch community.
And once you're in the door, there are experiences that are high, there are experiences that are low, there are experiences that are sweet, and there are experiences that are sour. Can you share some of those experiences with you, some stories that come top of mind?
It's such a slog, as you well know, every season getting to that live auction. So for us in New York, it was June and December. And from property getting to the publication of the catalog, all the deadlines that have to be met, reviewing photography, things that go into producing the sale that no one outside of the auction industry is really aware of. But for me, it's all of those interactions with clients between that are really, really memorable. So one in particular, it was the summer of 2016. So my first summer in New York, I was walking around in my suit and tie, sweating every day because I was not used to the humidity. So tough start already. But we had a client coming up from South America with an incredible collection, and you were dealing with them directly, which meant that I was dealing with them indirectly because at that point I was helping you very closely. And a couple of days before they get there, and this was a rep from South America that was working between the watch department and the client. She tells us that he has a favorite ice cream flavor. I believe it was butterscotch, and that it's important to have that available at the meeting. So the meeting was to determine his commission structure, how the watches would be presented, how they'd be offered. And so You say, Ryan, come into my office. Here's what you have to do this week. So big week for me. I have to find butterscotch ice cream in New York City to have at this meeting for the client. I go, okay, like, let me get on this. And I remember checking online everywhere possible that I could imagine. No butterscotch ice cream. So I'm starting to panic a little, but it's New York City. Someone has to have butterscotch ice cream. So we had an intern at the time too in the department, and I remember enlisting their help. No luck. So the day draws near, and we have to have some type of ice cream at this point because butterscotch could not be found. As unbelievable as that sounds, it was true. So I remember we have another type of ice cream presented for him. He comes into the meeting. You go in there. I wasn't in the room, but however long the meeting took after you come out, and I say, how did it go, John? And you said, great. We're going to have his collection at auction. And I said, but what about the ice cream? Did he enjoy it? Did he say anything about it not being butterscotch? And you said, oh, he didn't even touch it. He didn't even look at it. So I remember I was so nervous because it was just, you have to have this type of flavor ice cream for him, and couldn't get it done, which doesn't sound good looking back. But those types of stories, those memories really encapsulate the whole auction experience. It's like hardly about the watches when it comes down to it. It's just everything between.
On the sour side, wow. I bet there's some stories you could share, but it's tough. We can't name names or anything specific, but I'll tell you, in the auction world, you've experienced it. I've experienced. There are some downright abusive situations. Is there something you could share without identifying any of these people? So good luck with that question.
No, I think so. For the most part, we should preface this by saying that 99% of the clients are great, and a lot of them become friends and close confidants. But there are a few who are, slightly overbearing, let's say. I think it can come with the territory, especially when you're dealing with very high-end watches. In this particular case, I'm going to talk about it was a Patek Philippe minute repeating wristwatch. So, we're talking close to $1 million, but this watch was being shipped. And when we shipped watches of a certain value, we used an armored shipper. So I used to be the one that would help set up these shipments and the collections of these shipments and relaying to the client who would be there, when they would be there, how the whole pickup would work. And for a lot of people, it's pretty foreign because 2 armed guards come in an armored truck, and the client is supposed to have packed the watch in a box. That box gets sealed in a bag and then hand delivered by those armored guards to an airplane and then overnighted to the destination. So this all happened. This was going well. The watch gets picked up, but then there's a delay with the airline and they had to stop, and the shipment was delayed a day. So usually how we would do this is we would tell the client, oh, your watch has been delivered. Everything is 100% good. But in this case, I had to call the client and say the watch is delayed by a day. And to say this gentleman was unhappy would be an understatement. I just remember this was the first situation that I had ever experienced working in the auction world where it was just kind of unreasonable fury, something that we had no control over, and also probably would have no effect on the watch in the end or any of the whole operational process that we were doing. And so, I remember him fuming on the phone. I think one important thing and a good note of advice for anyone starting out is that, you have to respect yourself. And I told him, until you calm down, I'm not going to talk to you, and I'll talk to you later, and just hung up the phone. And I guess that could be construed as rude, but I think in those types of situations, you really have to stand up for yourself. So did that. And as you told me later, this was a big client of yours. And that really won the respect of him for me. And from that point on, he was the nicest guy ever to me and a loyal client to us. So just another funny story that encapsulates, I guess, the auction experience, but so nuanced, and you never expect those types of things will happen when you're doing your job day to day.
There's a life lesson there. I've seen this so many times. Is a client that you have friction with, and you stand up and just literally tell them to calm down, or in your case, you disengaged until they did calm down. Often they earn respect for you, and then they come back and in many cases become friends over time.
Yeah.
I invite that client to go have a beer with us next time you're in New York. And this is a meeting that will probably never happen, but
yeah.
Oh, great story. No, thanks for sharing those two memories. It's we could do like hours of podcasts of that, but I'm going to ask you a gotcha question right now. Be careful with this one. You work for both Sotheby's and Christie's, something I could also relate to. What are the main differences between the two houses, in your opinion?
Ooh, that is a tough one because I think I'm a very positive person. So maybe this is a positive spin on it, but I don't think there's a better order that I could have gone. I mean, there's only one other order, I guess, between the two, but starting at Christie's was great. It's very structured. And I'll give an example of that. I think this was frustrating at times because it is such a traditional corporate environment. But for example, on private sales, we always had to make at least 10% profit margin. So that killed a lot of deals, of course. And in the time that I've been doing this, the prices of watches have become so transparent that many clients think they know more than you when they're dealing with what they think they should be making or getting for their watch. Making 10% sometimes is out of the question. And if that happened at Christie's, where the deal would result in less than that, we just had to walk away. Very frustrating because it felt like you were leaving business on the table.
Remember deals at 9%? They're like, no, can't do it.
Yeah.
And we're not talking about $10,000 watches here. It's a lot more zeros.
The positive side of that was, I think it forced me to kind of help my negotiating skills and put myself in positions where it would be possible to get those types of numbers. And learning in that structured environment really helped me down the line. And this leads me to the difference between Christie's and Sotheby's. When I went to Sotheby's, granted it was 2020, the middle of the pandemic, so I think that might have had something to do with how the environment was. It's much more enterprising. I had a lot more leeway to do business how I saw fit. And that led to a lot more deals being done. Profit margins less than 10% in many cases, but that was the way of the market, especially 2020 and going into 2021. As we all know, the market really heated up across the board for certain brands and modern watches as a whole. But yeah, those two environments differ in that Christie's to me is much more structured and Sotheby's is a bit more entrepreneurial and allows the employees to kind of take advantage of roles and do business as they see fit, as long as it's benefiting the company.
Well, that's very interesting. And it's like my experience was like opposite. I found it was a different era. Like when I was first at Sotheby's, I found it extremely highly structured. And then when I went back to Christie's, and of course it was a few years later, I found Christie's was more entrepreneurial. But then I think that, like everything, the pendulum swings the other direction over time. And a lot of the employees too switch from house to house. It gets so confusing. I was like, well, I remember working with you at house X and then house Y. It gets quite confusing sometimes. It's the same people.
Yeah, it's so muddled. When I went over to Sotheby's, and I remember seeing people in the elevator that I thought looked familiar and I couldn't place them. And then I realized they worked at Christie's with me. So you're absolutely right. They just go back and forth.
And same with management in some cases. Wow. So here you have this amazing experience at two of the art world's most bureaucratic institutions. And then the pendulum swings yet again in a different direction. For you, you are part of the founding team of a startup that everyone is now buzzing about, called Bezel. What is Bezel?
So you're absolutely right. The pendulum has very much swung, and we are a tech startup. And so that's about as far removed from the auction culture as possible. But Bezel is a watches dedicated, authenticated marketplace. So like Chrono24, like eBay, watches are listed by sellers, and the seller provides all the assets. So description, images, pricing, and then it's hosted on our platform. If an order is placed by a buyer and it's accepted by the seller, then it gets sent to us in Los Angeles, where we're based, authenticated by our team, and then sent on to the buyer. So it is very similar to how GOAT or StockX operate in the sneaker world. And we've started out as an iOS app only for multiple reasons, which we can get into. Yeah, that's Bezel as it stands now. We received funding in August of last year and have been hitting the ground running ever since.
Before we talk about your role, I want to go back to GOAT and StockX, because many of our listeners will know exactly what you're talking about, and many will not. I frankly don't know much about these two companies. Can you comment on them, and especially their size and their transaction values and volume that you might know off the top of your head?
So StockX and GOAT are both technology companies. StockX started about 5 years ago, I believe, and maybe 6 years ago now, 2016, but based out of Detroit. And they started with sneakers, but also were hosting other categories, including watches, which they still do, but to a much more minimized degree than what they started with. So they only sell new items, but it's a marketplace where sellers will list those items. And just like the structure I mentioned for Bezel, that's the exact same process. So if an order is placed, it gets sent to StockX, they authenticate the item, and it gets sent on to the buyer. So from the last I've heard, they're supposed to IPO this year at around a $7 billion valuation. It's still a private company. I don't know if they have any plans to go the public route, but they're valued at around $4 billion. This is as of their last round of investments. So very successful in what they do, and both, again, in the sneaker space, which is about the third of the size of the pre-owned watch market, which, as we know, is roughly around 20 billion. So a third of that for sneakers. So yeah, so the blueprint for Bezel was to really follow in those footsteps, but dedicated to watches only.
It's amazing looking at the numbers and the valuations people are giving to StockX, for example, and then realizing there's nothing in the watch world that compares. There's no one that's gone down that path until now. That's incredible to me. Why don't you think it's happened yet?
So Chrono 24, obviously very, very successful at what they've done. And they've been around since the early 2000s. And as of their last funding, which took place early last year, they're valued at just around $1 billion. I think what has been missing, though, from business models like that, or like eBay, who is obviously a behemoth in the space and does an incredible amount of value in watches each year, is the tech component and really I would call it the 21st century spin on a website or app. And what we're focused on, the founding team consists of my colleagues Quade Walker, who was previously at Google as a lead product design on Google TV, our CTO, Daryl Johnson, machine learning engineer at Google, and then Chase Pion, who worked in investment banking previously in New York and at several hedge funds. So that is the core team, including myself. And that spin on this business coming directly from Silicon Valley really is, I think, something that just hasn't been done. Not to put down those other platforms, but I think eBay has been around so long and they offer a multitude of items. You could buy a $20 pair of used sneakers next to a $100,000 Patek Philippe. And I think that doesn't inspire confidence in a buyer that's looking on that platform. Chrono 24 is great. And what they do is show you every possible watch you could ever want to see. And they are at the volume that we aim to reach, but they don't necessarily contextualize the watches that they're selling in a way that I think also inspires confidence in a buyer. So the way that we aim to combat that is with the editorial arm. And so Isaac Wingold, who worked with us while we were at Christie's, is heading up our editorial team for now and writing some incredible articles, as well as providing context for what these purchases would be. So let's say the background on a Daytona. Of course, there's numerous articles online about that, but I think what is lacking in the market right now is a place that brings all of that together. And so we have that all within one app, and that's Bezel.
And also within one team. I mean, I've met some of your colleagues, researched into them a bit, and you're literally working with tech royalty from Silicon Valley, and then there's you, who I think is horological royalty. So tell me about your role. What's your role on the team?
Well, that's very generous of you to say. I don't know if that's true, but my role on the team is actually everything related to watches. So at the beginning, it was very important for us to get inventory on. So I leveraged my connections working with dealers in New York and LA, anywhere within the US, to get inventory onto the app. And so we have over $12 million listed at this point, I believe, of watches that are available and ready for sale. Really building out the whole flow from a seller's perspective. So what does a seller need to convey in terms of the information about a watch that will allow a buyer to purchase it with confidence? What picture angles, what descriptions are needed for accessories? So I never even realized this until we started with Bezel, but the terminology that we use at auction is 100% different than what a dealer on 47th Street in New York would use. So I think at auction, we'll say outer box, presentation box. To dealers, it's all one box. That's all that matters. And so reconciling differences like that is something that's been really fun and a challenge to do. But the aim of what we've been doing is to streamline that as much as possible and to make it as easy for a buyer to comprehend as possible so that we convert on purchases.
Now, you've convinced me to list on Bezel. Thank you for that, because I will more on that later. But can you answer to the general public, why should I list on Bezel?
The first thing would be the fees. We have extremely transparent and lower fees than most other platforms. The same exact way that GOAT and StockX have turned collectors and non-professional sellers into repeat sellers is what we aim to do. And a commission structure is a large part of that. So as you list, the more watches that you sell, the higher the GMV, the lower your commission goes. So we have extremely competitive rates. The payment time is quicker than most other platforms as well, because if something is ordered and confirmed by the seller, it gets shipped to us overnight, authenticated within a day or two, and then shipped out to the buyer. But as soon as the authentication takes place is when the funds are released to the seller. So we take responsibility for those sales because we feel very confident about our authentication process. And so, a lot of times people just want to get paid as fast as possible, and that's what we aim to do. Another reason to list on Bezel would be our audience, or growing audience, I should say. But the marketing that we have in store and are rolling out right now with the launch this past week is very targeted towards these people that are interested in, I would say, everything from modern watches to neo vintage, we'll call them, and back to vintage. And so we're really covering all the bases there. And the aim is to get first-time buyers, people that don't know much about watches, giving them the ability to learn about them through our content, and then again, catalyzing purchases through that process. So I think our conversion rate, it's so early that it's hard to say, but so far it's been very, very high. And we feel confident that continuing with that model will result in success for us.
So tell me about the app and what's different and what inspired your team to build it the way it is, that is connecting in a different way than we've seen before with a younger clientele.
Sure. So I first have to give credit to Quade and Daryl on the product side, because the app looks the way, and the whole engineering team really, because the app looks the way it does because of them. And Quade is supremely talented at design, and the feedback that I've been getting in this early stage is that the user experience and interface is just incredible and head and shoulders above anything else that exists. And of course, I'm biased and I'm very close to the product, but I'd have to agree. I think, within watches, presentation is really a lot. If you see a seller with good photos listed online or on Instagram as you're scrolling, I can't put a number on it, but you're X amount more times likely to stop and look at that watch and inspect it than if it's a bad photo. So that translates to the overall appearance of the app. And I think that we've really captured that. The intuitive experience that you mentioned, I think, is based on the whole flow of the app and how it goes from browsing in, like we mentioned, this contextualized experience with articles, with collections that we have. So if you were to be interested in, say, a new ceramic Daytona, we have every model, every reference broken down into their own pod. So 116-500 LN, let's say white dial, has its own header image. You would click into that. It has all of the information about that model, all of the specs. And then within that, at the bottom, it would tell you how many listings we have. So let's say we have 5 listings at this time. It says 5 listings, and then you can sort them by unworn and pre-owned, and you'll see all the prices. You'll see the condition issues if they have any. You see the accessories listed. Like I was mentioning earlier about one of the challenges and part of my job there is to really break down what is needed to be seen by a buyer in order to make a decision. And so those are some of the things that we decided upon. So really it's just a more organized way of finding something, learning about it, and then deciding to purchase it. And the purchase flow, again, is this 21st century experience where you can pay with Apple Pay. You can swipe a credit card to buy. It's very simple, and it's just easy. I think everyone is on their phone these days. I think, like you mentioned, this younger generation of watch buyers, they're browsing their phone all day, mostly on Instagram, I would say, and then going to those sites of the dealers. For us, I think unless you're somewhat in the know with watches, John Reardon, Patek Philippe expert, Eric Wynn, probably going to go to him for a vintage Rolex. But it's often daunting. And so creating a brand name like a Bezel or an equivalent would be like StockX for sneakers. It's very obvious when someone has a new pair of sneakers and then they tell you, I got it on StockX. Everyone knows what that is. And so that's what we're aiming to do with watches. And I think the whole design and flow of the app is geared towards that.
I love it. I mean, I guess I'm actually thinking of one of my favorite shows, Silicon Valley. Are there any startup stories that you can share that kind of relate to that Silicon Valley conquer the world mentality?
We did get an office in LA, and it's been really fun being in there every day with the whole team. It's an incredibly collaborative environment. I think a lot of what you hear about startups is, it's so bootstrapped, and that's really true. You take out the trash at the end of the day too. You don't have a janitorial service that comes. That's reserved for big companies. So we're doing everything from A to Z. That's what makes it fun. That's what has everyone bought in and so confident about what we're doing. And I think that's really kind of that startup mentality that we all have and share.
Well, congratulations for what you're doing. We're gonna pivot to Patek Philippe right now, but I think the watch community is going to be watching your career and what Bezel is doing very closely, because when someone gets this right, it'll be critical mass towards that new, whether it's an app or website or new way of doing business. The business is so big that even grabbing a couple percentage points of it is massive. I 20 billion a year is a conservative estimate. And I think if you can grab some of that market share, we'll be cheering for you.
Thanks. I really appreciate that. I think what we have in store is really exciting, and not to be lost is the fact that we are a technology company first. So some of what we'll implement in the coming months and coming years will really be disruptive and innovative to the watch space. So I can't say much more than that at this point, but I encourage everyone to keep their eyes on it.
Before we wrap up on Bezel, can you tell us the website and your Instagram handle?
Yeah. So the website is getbezel.com. The Instagram handle is getbezel. And yeah, please follow us there.
Now let's talk about Patek Philippe and your experiences and opinions. I think back to the 90s and the 2000s. I personally felt like I was the youngest guy in the room because I got into this as a teenager. And I always looked up to people in the business and asked, what's the best? How can I learn about it? And it's funny to see how that's changed in going into the world post-pandemic. I now feel like I'm one of the older guys. It's a really incredible shift that's happened to me in my life. You're now a global voice on the market. And I really want to hear what you and your peers think of Patek Philippe in particular. And we'll go into some various collecting categories, because bottom line is you're the future. Your age demographic is the future, and that future is now. So let's start with this. What's your brand perception of Patek Philippe?
I think I have been And I am very grateful for this, heavily influenced by you personally for what I like. And that's vintage Patek Philippe, particularly complicated watches. I don't think that's a sentiment shared by many of my peers. I think since I've been in the industry, it's been a very interesting time, and there's definitely been a shift. What I speak about mostly when working with clients similar to my age range is modern Patek Philippe, of course, Nautilus, Aquanaut, steel watches. But for me, I think the brand my perception is very traditional, which I think would be the perception of most, but also very calculated. And that's why they've remained Patek Philippe for so long. I think that may be lost on some of my peers who have not been closely following Patek Philippe's history or had the privilege of working with someone like you who is so well versed in that and always looking for the next release, always looking for the next hype watch, we'll say. I don't like that term necessarily, but I think when some of these prices have gone up 100% in the last year and a half, it's hard not to say that. So I think as it stands right now, and not to get into the market as a whole overall, but I think there will be a pullback for some of these modern pieces, which will be healthy. And that slight correction is needed because it's just not in line with how these watches should be valued when you consider all that Patek Philippe makes. And I'm talking about dress watches, complicated watches, precious metal watches. So my perception of Patek Philippe is they know exactly what they're doing. And I think it's more so for everyone else to catch on to that, and so that we can be in line with their vision.
Are you seeing, I mean, you're in LA. I'm seeing in the media, like leading personalities, the pop world, even on social media, picking up on the brand more than ever before. It's exciting, but just being out and about in LA, are you seeing Patek Philippe more mainstream?
Yeah, I see, it feels like everyone wearing an Aquanaut, which I don't think was the case when I first started back almost 7 years ago now. So watches like that have just become such mainstream icons. And those are perpetuated by people in hip hop, people in sports, whichever area it may be. And for me, what's really interesting about that is I think if Patek Philippe had their way, and I obviously don't know what the brand thinks exactly, but that wouldn't be how they want it represented. And I'm sure you know much more than me about this, but I think that's a very interesting kind of gap that they have to reckon with. And who they want wearing their watches, they can of course not control that. But like you see with the new Nautilus Tiffany, worn by some of the most famous people in the world, not necessarily long-standing Patek Philippe collectors. I think that's very interesting.
Shocking. It's but I think we have another episode about the whole Tiffany Nautilus. But I'd like to talk about another retailer that's right in your neck of the woods, and that's Geary's. And for those of you who've not been to Beverly Hills, Geary's is the place to go for Patek Philippe and Rolex. Problem is there's no inventory these days, but that's a global situation. But imagine you, Ryan Chong, can go into Geary's and order any Patek Philippe modern and have it delivered tomorrow. What would that reference be? What would be your choice?
So I would go with the 5205G. I would like, the dial code escapes me, but the black dial, no longer in production, but they still produce the blue dial. I'm a big fan of the annual calendar complication, and I know you've touched it on in previous podcasts, but I think they're heavily undervalued. Obviously, Patek Philippe was the first brand to serialize the complication and introduce it to the world. And yeah, the 5205 for me really encapsulates everything I'd want in a modern watch in terms of design and size and wearability, and also has that Patek Philippe spin with the complication.
Great choice. I didn't expect that from you. I'm glad you didn't say Aquanaut. So.
No.
Wow. So Patek Philippe has this new younger audience that's engaged, but mostly through steel watches and from pieces they're seeing on social media. What, in your opinion, could Patek Philippe do better to reach a new audience as this audience grows up in the world of watches?
That's an interesting question because I don't know if they necessarily need to reach a new audience. the following is so strong already. I think if they are trying to get younger people to buy the dress watches, the more complicated watches, then it's almost like the market forces are working towards them, working in their favor for that, because with Aquanauts, Nautiluses, any steel model not being possible at retail, being such outrageously expensive in the secondary market, it's pushing people towards buying the less valued models, and those are the dressed and complicated watches. So it's almost like they don't need help in that area, and it's just happening for them.
The year 2039 is going to be very important for the world of Patek Philippe, because it's going to be the 200th anniversary of the founding of Patek Philippe. So I'm imagining you in the year 2039 going into the authorized retailer of your choice and picking out a watch. What do you think that'll be?
I think it would depend on what new models came out. Like I mentioned, primarily am interested in vintage watches. So, you can't go wrong with any Calatrava, a 565, a 570, classics, let's call them. But in 2039, I have no idea what they'll be offering. I would hope that it's harkening back to those watches from the golden period of their production, because I would love to have a modern version of that I could wear every day and not think about really. So that's a tough question, because I guess I'll have to see. But I think you reminded me of an interesting story that takes me back to the auction days when I first started. So I guess in 2039, it'll be the 50th anniversary of the Caliber 89. This is a bit of a tangent, but within the first 6 months of being at Christie's, we had a Caliber 89 for private sale. And at that point, still new to watches, still learning everything about Patek Philippe that there was to learn. But I don't think there could have been a better example of a watch to learn from than the Caliber 89. And you were so gracious with your time and knowledge and telling me about the immense amount of complications that it had in the history and why it was produced for 1989, their 150th anniversary at that time. And yeah, just putting two and two together, the 50 years later, that's a pretty impressive watch. And I think in 2039, it's still going to be very coveted. Probably anyone would go back in time and buy it at the price that we had it for in 2016.
What an honor to have that watch in hand. And that was the first, the yellow gold version of the Caliber 89. And you're right, I didn't think of that. It'll be 50 years old in the year 2039. And I love thinking about it from a futuristic perspective, because the watches released today and Watches and Wonders, which everyone's buzzing about, they're going to be essentially vintage watches in the year 2039. That's intriguing. And everyone's always thinking, oh, the watches today will never be vintage. But I mean, that's the march of time. And we're looking at pieces made now in the year 2000 and 2005 is quite early. And that just intrigues me. Do you have any particular favorite vintage Patek Philippe watches?
Yes. So mine would be the 1526, the first perpetual calendar ever produced in a series by Patek Philippe, or by any brand for that matter. But yeah, that's perpetual calendars for me just are really romantic and encapsulate this feeling that watches as a whole, I think, do when I think about the passage of time and their importance in our lives. So for me, that you can't do better than a 1526.
Oh, what a great choice. It's pretty underappreciated now. Hard to find, but still underappreciated. There's great value of that reference. You touched upon this earlier, but what is the appetite for vintage Patek Philippe watches in your age bracket? Are you seeing it? Are people talking about it?
I think with the boom in the market that we've mentioned already over the past couple of years, all the focus has been on modern. And my experience is that all of these new clients that I've come to know in the past couple of years have been interested in modern because of those are the headline grabbing watches. Vintage is really an acquired taste, and of course can be daunting if you're not very familiar with watches. But I think, and I hope that a lot of these modern buyers will eventually convert to vintage. And as they learn more about watches and the history of Patek Philippe or other brands, that will be really interesting to see. Because for me, it's obvious. There's just so much more with vintage watches than modern watches in terms of their character, their charm. and the value is there. I don't see why there wouldn't be this conversion of those buyers for modern watches, which is primarily, I think, what most people are interested in today that I'm meeting and working with, translating to vintage.
Are you seeing any interest in pocket watches?
I think I'm too far removed. So when I was at Sotheby's or Christie's, yes, there were clients that, and we both know them, and I'm sure you know who I'm thinking of, but multiple clients who collected pocket watches with great passion. Again, incredible value. I think for me personally, my collecting philosophy, which is not original at all, is buy the best possible condition. And so pocket watches really offer an incredible way to do that because there are just so many that are in perfect untouched condition. Yeah, I think it's similar to how these modern buyers hopefully will convert to vintage as they learn about watches as a whole. But I think that down the line, pocket watches will have somewhat of a resurgence.
I think from what I'm seeing and hearing and who Collectability is selling to, we're not selling pocket watches to people in their 20s. It just hasn't happened. Yeah. I would say occasionally in the 30s, but definitely 40s, 50s and up. So it's interesting. And I wonder if it's something that will be discovered in the future from your age demographic. One trend that's really been a pleasant surprise is the number of female collectors we see coming into buying vintage Patek Philippe. Are you seeing that? And in your age demographic, there are a lot of rising stars who are female watch collectors. It's a different demographic altogether. So what are you hearing and seeing?
Totally. So one, I think it's great that there is. I think it's always been there, but it's just not been as out in the open as it is now, which is a very positive thing. But female collecting is having this moment where there are collectors that are coming to light that have been doing it for years and now feel comfortable stepping out and saying, here's my collection. This is what I'm interested in. And plus this whole new group of female collectors that are just learning about watches and sharing that passion amongst themselves. I think it's great. I think what is somewhat of a recent phenomena is the interest in men's watches or larger watches by women. And so that interest is allowing women to look at a broader range of models and consider them for their collections. So yeah, as a whole, we definitely are working with a lot of women at Bezel now who are looking for their first watch, their second watch, whatever watch it is, and considering models that I would not have expected them to. So that's been a nice surprise.
It's incredible because it's we're one of the few collectibles that people from all age demographics, all backgrounds around the world are collecting. And of course, right now we're talking about Patek Philippe, but I mean, you could at any price point buy an amazing vintage watch. And I mean, I had so much fun collecting Walthams and Elgins as a teenager, and you get incredible value. And I'm starting to see more people getting into it. And one trend that I love is more women buying pendant watches at all price points to wear. I don't want to say as jewelry, but to wear as conversation piece. And on a beautiful gold chain around the neck, a pendant watch from the 1890s is a story to tell that a lot of things you can't buy in a store will tell a story equal to that. We'll see. Maybe Bezel will have a pocket watch one of these days.
Bezel will certainly offer pocket watches down the line. I think, not to get back too much in what we're doing, but that's one of the challenges that we will solve. Basically, the idea is to upload what you have knowledge base wise into our app. So someone looking for, okay, let's use 24.99s. I mean, pretty out of touch example, but everything you would want to know between a first and a fourth series, what makes them special, and then have those buckets that I was talking about for specific references within the app. And then each of those buckets breaking down the exact differences between the series, allowing a user to look at what we have listed, make a decision based on the information that we provide. Similar to how you educate about Patek Philippe, but doing this across brands. Of course, Rolex is the most difficult probably to do this for, just because there is so much variability dating back to the 50s with those models. So that's really the most interesting part, I think, of offering vintage watches on an app like Bezel.
How do you define vintage versus modern in the world of Patek Philippe specifically?
So you've always instilled in me the 20-year rule or thereabouts, which I use as a rule of thumb. I think I'm pretty lucky because my birth year is around the time where I would consider the breakdown of modern versus vintage. So that's easy for me to remember. But I think references like 50, 70 that are considered modern classics now. I don't know if that's the term that you would use to describe them, but 5970s, 5004s, models like that, that's really the start of modern for me.
No, I couldn't agree more, but I like your idea. If it's older than Ryan, it's vintage. Younger than Ryan, it's modern. That could be a new thing. I think in the watch world, everyone's goal is to have a dial named after them. You know, like a Patrizzi dial,
Buckley dial,
Paul Newman. I mean, it's really incredible. But for you, maybe we could age watches based on you, Ryan.
I don't know if I'll like that though as I get older.
Yeah, exactly. It won't work after a while. So it works today, but not tomorrow. So our last line of questioning is: I'm curious of your perceptions of the overall market today and where it's going. You're starting something new, but you worked in the quote, the old world of the watch market while you were at auction. And now you're in the new world for sure. So where's all of this going? And what is the industry missing today that you think you can bring to the table?
So previous guests of yours on this podcast have touched on the amount of new bidders at, say, a Philips auction, or just the amount of new customers that they deal with on a day-to-day basis. And I see the exact same thing. I think there is overwhelming interest in wristwatches as a collectible and also now as an investment. I think fractional ownership of wristwatches is something that has already been started by several companies, but is something that will increase as well as the values continue to remain strong or go up in some cases. I think this new interest, this new buyer that is coming into the space, there will be a lot more education that has to be done on watches. And as we mentioned, they gravitate towards moderns first because it's just easier to understand. But I think what's exciting and what we'll see in the years to come is this renewed interest in vintage watches. So I'm very excited about that. I'm very hopeful about that because that's where I think both of our passion lies. And I'm very excited for the future of watches, and I think that it's only going to continue to increase.
We're coming to the end of this podcast, and there's so many other lines of questioning I'd like to go down, but I first want to thank you so much for your time, telling us what you're doing with Bezel, what you think of Patek Philippe, and what your age demographic and how they perceive this brand that's so near and dear to our hearts. We'll be watching your career closely, as they say. We'll be watching what Bezel does closely. Do you have any parting thoughts for our audience?
First, thank you so much for having me. It's truly an honor. I listened to the podcast. Even if I didn't know you, I'd listen to the podcast because I think it's just really great educational content and hearing the different perspectives of the guests you have on. But kind of what I touched on earlier with the watch community just being so helpful and accepting and encouraging, I'd like to thank you first and foremost, our previous colleagues at Christie's, Eric Wind, Brandon Frazen, Rich Lopez, Elisa Catanazzi, who's with you now, Rebecca Ross, everyone I worked with at Sotheby's, from Janet Tham, Christina Bone, Darren Schnipper, Fred Watrello, who's in Dubai now. It sounds like an Oscar speech. You probably want me to shut up, but
no, this is great.
Honestly, just incredible working with people across the globe. I think it's important to remember that watches really bring people together. It sounds so corny, but it's so true. The experiences that I've had working with watches really just are all positive, and I couldn't have imagined a better career that I didn't know I was going to have.
Thank you, Ryan. And those are beautiful words and wonderfully stated. As we wrap this up, I'd just like to say this was the 13th episode in our Collectability podcast series. And I want to thank you, all of our guests, for listening. If you have enjoyed this podcast, please like and subscribe. Remember to follow us in the podcast player you enjoy using in order not to miss a future recording. Thank you so much for listening. This is John Reardon for Collectability.